in the Swiss Bank. And according to Jarius Bondok, a columnist of the Philippine Star, there is also a 174 billion peso worth of confiscated cash, real estate and bonds. He further disclosed that in 1971, the BIR assessed the amount of 23.3 billion pesos in estate taxes on the estate left by the dictator Marcos. Ini si Marcos Jr. usa sa mga administrator sa estate, wala gyud mo bayad nining kantidara nga karon mikabat na sa 203.8 billion. This Marcos Jr. has shown no remorse for all the atrocities and evils committed by his father during martial law years. He repeatedly said that he will not apologize for this because he was still very young then to know them. This is not true. Upon the proclamation of martial law, he was already a bright man of 50 years. His biodata nagpakita nga from 1976 to 1978, he was already an undergraduate degree student of Oxford University in England, and that from 1979 to 1981, he was already taking up a graduate course in business administration at Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania, USA. Yet, while he denied all these atrocities, evils, and iniquities committed by his father, he in a recent interview promised that if he become president, he will not do what his father had done during those Marcos martial law years. A promise can only be based on admission that he knew. Yet again, he did not apologize. The long and short of this is that when he would become president, this Marcos Jr. will not only perpetuate the memory of his father and make him the greatest Filipino president, and even a saint to be honored, adored, and glorified by the Filipino people. With boldness, he will proclaim the reign of his father as the golden years of our country and our people. Then, to preserve it for posterity, he will repeat what his father had done, and even do more. This is the real reason why he will not apologize to the Filipino people for the evils, atrocities, and iniquities his father had committed. God forbid that Marcos Jr., this bongbong, be our next president. With utmost candor, I say that this Marcos Jr. must, before seeking the presidency, completely purify his heart. He must undergo some spiritual and temporal healing. He can start this healing by first hearing the cries of the victims of martial law and their families. Second, by sincerely apologizing to the Filipino people for the atrocities, evils, and iniquities committed by his father, especially during the martial law years. Third, by returning to the Filipino people the remaining ill-gotten wealth amassed by the Marcoses. Fourth, by paying and satisfying all money judgments in cases for the recovery of ill-gotten wealth, and paying all unpaid taxes, such as the estate tax on the estate of the father. With utmost candor, I assert that voting for and electing Marcos Jr. as president would be disloyalty and a great disservice to our country and our people. The election of Bongbong Marcos Jr. would mean forgetting, approving, and endorsing the Marcos martial law and all its atrocities, evils, and iniquities. The election of Marcos Jr. would guarantee a repeat of these atrocities, evils, and iniquities. The election of Marcos Jr. would be a blanket authority and license for Marcos Jr. to follow in the footsteps of his father, which can easily do by declaring martial law, and like what his father did, prolong his reign. The election of Marcos Jr. would render meaningless and historically irrelevant the People Power Revolt in EDSA, which ended the martial law regime. The election of Marcos would put an inglorious end to all our efforts to recover from the dictator Marcos and his family the ill-gotten wealth which they had amassed, and would lead to the dismissal of all cases of recovery against them. The election of Marcos Jr. would be an installation of a president who is confirmed tax evader. He will serve as model for all tax evaders today and the future. Marcos Jr., through his Congress, will not hesitate to grant tax amnesty with the Marcos family as the first beneficiary. As a tax evader, Marcos Jr. has shown that he has now no respect at all for our laws. Daghan pa kaayo nga ikasulti ko ni ani. The election of Marcos would put our country to shame and disrepute before the United Nations, because as he had already announced, he will not, as president, allow the prosecutors of the International Criminal Court to come to the Philippines to conduct investigations on the charges of crimes against humanity filed against President Duterte in the ICT. This is an outright condonation of crimes against humanity, which the United Nations has long condemned and penalized through the ICC Charter. Such a pronouncement also expresses Marcos Jr.'s affirmance of the unilateral act of President Duterte withdrawing the Philippine membership in the ICC. This condonation or affirmance would place the Philippines in bad light before the United Nations, as both manifest a propensity to disregard our country's duty of adherence and the principles of the United Nations embodied in the Charter. Taas pa kaayo ang ako ikasulti ni ine o labi na gayud sa atong mga youth. Pero igahin ko na lang ang laing adlaw ni ine kay nagkamubo ng atong panahon. Let me just conclude for today. The election of Marcos Jr. would be installing a president who has already demonstrated a mindset, a propensity, an inclination not to faithfully safeguard, honor, and fulfill the solemn oath of the President prescribed in our Constitution. Ang oath ni Ana, ngilingig ka ng oath, very solemn oath. Unya, ang may tabo ni Ana, iya na lang ka na. Wadon. The election of Marcos would be an installation of a president who is not possessed of virtues, values, and principles which a true and faithful servant leader must possess. He would be a leader to be served, not to serve. Yet, we shall persevere in our prayer for the gifts of the Holy Spirit that Marcos Jr. will reform and be renewed with a purified heart. Thus I say, never again a Marcos as president. Who then shall we elect as president? It is VP Leni Robredo and no one else. She is the best and the most qualified among the 10 candidates for president. Her name alone stands for living embodiment of nobility and integrity. Let us all move fast in our campaigns for her. Mag-house-to-house campaign ta, mag-heart-to-heart campaign ta for Leni as president and Kiko as vice president. God bless us all. God bless the Philippines. Ugma, lain ta nga muhos din ako i-anunsyo ugma, muanhay ko ugma kadyot, pag-anunsyo lang sa atong next host. Salamat kayo o mayong adlaw.
Ang tao kinahanglang maminaw sa iyang konsensya. Ang konsensya anaa sa galamhan sa matag tao ug kini mao ang mopahinumdom kaniya sa pagbuhat ug matarong inay sa dautan. Kini ang tingog sa katarong, kaangayan ug kini mo'y tingog sa labawong makagagahom. Apan tungod sa nagkalain-laing hinungdan, adunay mga higayon nga ang tao dili na makadungog sa balaanong tingog sa iyang konsensya. Kini mo'y nagdasig niining maong tulumanon sa